I have a particular skill, which is that I am very good at not making a situation worse. That sounds like a small thing. In 8 years of cultural integration work at Kessaldivar Joint Settlement Processing Hub, I have come to understand that it is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing that matters in the first 72 hours of a newly arrived species contact cycle. You do not need to know their history. You do not need to speak their language, though a working vocabulary helps. You do not need to understand their kinship systems or their dietary requirements or the way they organize their personal space, though you will learn all of this. What you need at the start is the discipline to do nothing that cannot be undone. I learned this from a woman named Corath Vale, who was my supervisor for the first 3 years, and who said it to me on my second day in a tone that suggested she was not giving advice but issuing an operational directive. She said, "Rena, in this work, the most dangerous thing you can do is act from instinct. Instinct is calibrated to your own species. It will betray you every time." I thought about Corath on the afternoon I met Sale. The Integration Residential Wing occupies the upper level of the hub's eastern annex, a long corridor of rooms designed for provisional occupation, for the first weeks of settlement processing, for lives that are half unpacked and not yet certain they will unpack the rest. The corridor smells of fabricated air and unfamiliar cooking, and the particular plasticky warmth of environmental units running at species-adjusted settings. The common room at the corridor's end has 8 chairs and a table and a row of supply shelves and a window that looks out over the hub's secondary docking ring, where the smaller transit vessels come and go all day. I have spent a great deal of time in that common room over the years. It is where people wait. I have learned to read waiting the way a meteorologist reads weather, the quality of it, the wait, how long it has been building, whether the person waiting believes the thing they are waiting for will actually arrive. The Velthari family had arrived 3 days earlier. Devan Lori, Sale's mother, was a resettlement applicant under the Bilateral Welfare Extension Program, a slim woman with lavender-gray skin and close-cropped pale hair, and an expression of careful composure that I recognized as the expression of someone who has been composed for a very long time because the alternative was not available. She had answered every intake question precisely. She had completed every documentation step without error. She had not asked for anything she was not entitled to ask for, and she had not asked for several things she was entitled to ask for, which told me something about her experience of institutional systems up to this point. Her daughter was called Sale. I had met Sale twice in the 3 days. Once at the initial intake, standing behind her mother and watching me with the particular quality of stillness that very young Velthari children apparently maintain in unfamiliar environments. And once in the corridor when I was doing a routine check of the environmental sensors, and she was sitting cross-legged outside their room's door with a small object in her hands that I did not look at too carefully, because looking at things other people are holding can be read as various kinds of intrusion, depending on the species. She had observed me going about my work with the composed attention of someone who has learned that observation is a safe form of engagement. You can watch without being in the way, without asking anything, without making a claim on the space. I had nodded to her in a way that I hoped read as neutral acknowledgement. She had not nodded back, but she had continued to watch me, which I took as a neutral sign. In 8 years I have learned that the neutral signs are often the ones that matter. On the afternoon in question, I was covering the wing alone. Vel Corath, our Velthari cultural attaché, was due from the secondary hub at 1600. Devan Lori had a processing appointment at the Bilateral Affairs Office at 1400 that was expected to run 90 minutes. She had asked, with the careful precision that characterized all of her requests, whether it was permissible for Sale to remain in the common room while she attended. I had said yes. I had said that I would be in the wing for the duration, and that the common room was a supervised space. She had received this information, and then looked at me for a moment in a way I could not entirely read, not suspicious, not relieved exactly, but the way you look at something you are deciding whether to trust, not because you have a reason to distrust it, but because you have learned that the verification step matters regardless. Then she had gone. Sale was in the common room when I arrived at 14:15 to log the afternoon's environmental readings. She was sitting in one of the 8 chairs with her feet not reaching the floor and the same small object in her hands that I had seen in the corridor. And she was very still in a way that was not restless stillness, but a quality of attention that I had begun to associate with the Velthari generally. A settled, deliberate quietness, like a sensor array that has completed its calibration and is simply registering. The object in her hands appeared to be a small figure carved from pale stone, the kind of thing you make or carry when you need something with weight and permanence. I logged the readings. I checked the supply shelf inventory, which was not necessary but gave me something to do that was not directed at her. I was aware, in the practiced way that 8 years in integration work develops, of her awareness of me. Not watchfulness in the sense of wariness, just registration. She was noting what I did. I have been in rooms with many species over the years, and the experience of being noted rather than watched is a distinction I have become sensitive to. Being watched implies a question. Being noted implies a record. I found the noting easier than the watching, though I could not have said exactly why. After about 10 minutes of this, I said, because silence between 2 people in a room is eventually more conspicuous than speech, that I had grain paste on the supply shelf if she was hungry. I said it to the supply shelf rather than directly to her, because direct address to unaccompanied children in integration settings can read as a variety of things depending on the species, and I had not yet had a chance to review the Velthari cultural orientation module that Vel Korath had promised to send me before his arrival. Sale looked at the supply shelf. Then she looked at me. Then she said, in trade language that was careful and slightly formal, that she was not hungry but thank you. I said you're welcome and went back to the inventory. At 14:38 she slid off the chair and walked to the supply shelf and looked at it. I continued with the inventory and did not comment, because the supply shelf was accessible to wing residents and she was a wing resident. She looked at the items on the shelf with the same deliberate noting attention she applied to everything, not browsing but assessing, going through each item in sequence with the systematic care of someone who has learned not to take things for granted. Then she took a small packet of dried fruit that was listed under general provisions and returned to her chair with it. She did not eat it, she held it and looked at it. I said, because it seemed relevant, that it was Veloran cultivar, grown on the resettlement corridor's agricultural tier. I said this to the inventory tablet. I said that the particular variety was called Kelvith in Veloran, which meant approximately stone sweet, because the fruit had a mineral quality underneath the sweetness that the agricultural registry described as characteristic of the corridor's soil composition. I added that information because I had it, and it seemed like information she might want, not because I expected her to respond. Sale said, without looking up from the packet, that she knew this variety, that her grandmother had grown it. I said that was a good variety to know. There was a pause, and then Sale said that her grandmother's farm was in the eastern corridor, that they had left it 3 months ago. I said that 3 months was a long time to be traveling. She said yes. She said it in a way that made it clear the word contained more than the word. In 8 years I have learned to hear that register, the yes that is the compressed form of a longer accounting that the speaker has decided, for reasons that make sense to them, not to deliver in full. I did not ask her to deliver it. That is not my role in the first 72 hours, and often not my role at any point afterward. I am not a counselor. I am an integration specialist. My job is to make the structural environment as navigable as possible, so that people can settle into it at whatever pace their experience allows. Asking people to explain their losses before they are ready to explain them is not making the environment navigable. It is making it smaller. So I went back to the inventory, and Sale held the packet of dried fruit, and the common room was quiet except for the environmental unit and the distant sounds of the docking ring. The primary star was at a low angle outside the window, cutting through the docking ring's superstructure in long horizontal lines. Sale watched the light for a while. I watched the inventory screen. We were both, in our separate ways, doing what we did in unfamiliar rooms, noting what was there and what was not. At 14:52, the filing terminal on the common room table chimed. I checked it. The notification was from Velketh Administrative Services, Secondary Division. It was timestamped 1449. It was a provisional guardianship inquiry, filing under Article 7C of the Compact Resettlement Welfare Protocol, citing the current absence of Devon Say Laurie from the Integration Wing, and requesting confirmation of unaccompanied minor status for a registered Velthari minor. Sale, case reference number KAR 1110 VAES. I read it twice. Article 7C was a legitimate provision. It existed because occasionally, in the processing gap when a settlement applicant attended a required appointment, children were genuinely left without adequate supervision, left in circumstances that constituted actual unaccompanied minor status under the bilateral welfare framework. The provision allowed administrative services to flag such circumstances and, under specific conditions, to file for provisional guardianship if the unaccompanied period exceeded a defined threshold, without a registered welfare contact present. The threshold was 2 hours. We were currently at 52 minutes. The registered welfare contact provision required a compact registered integration specialist or welfare officer to be present in the facility and logged as the supervising contact for the duration of the unaccompanied period. I was a compact registered integration specialist. I was present in the facility. I had logged my presence at shift start at 1400. What I had not done, because Devon Say Laurie had asked informally and I had agreed informally, and the formal logging procedure had not crossed my mind as necessary because it is the kind of procedure you do automatically after 8 years until the one time you don't, was log myself as the designated supervising contact for Sale specifically. The filing was, technically, in compliance with the provision. The window was legitimate. The filing was early. They had filed at 52 minutes rather than waiting for the 2-hour threshold, which told me something about how carefully they had been watching the processing schedule and something about what they wanted, but it was within the procedural bounds. If I did not respond, the window would continue to run. At 2 hours, they could escalate. An escalated Article 7C inquiry in an active case generated an automatic administrative hold on the settlement processing that could take between 3 and 6 weeks to clear. 3 to 6 weeks added to 3 months already in transit. I did not look at Sale while I processed this. I pulled up the registration module for designated supervising contacts, entered my credentials, entered Sale's case reference number, and registered myself as the designated supervising welfare contact for the duration of Devon Say Laurie's processing appointment, with a start time logged retroactively to 1400 when I had first arrived in the wing. The retroactive logging was permissible under Section 3 of the Integration Specialist Operational Protocol because I had been continuously present, and the absence of the formal entry was an administrative omission rather than a factual one. I had been here. The corridor sensors confirmed it. The environmental log confirmed it. The registration confirmed what was already true. I filed a counter-notification to the Velketh Administrative Services inquiry at 1455, citing the registered supervision status and the retroactive log entry, and attaching the corridor's environmental sensor records confirming my continuous presence in the wing from 1400 onward. I also attached a copy of Devon Say Laurie's processing appointment schedule, confirming the scheduled return window of 15:30, and a note that the unaccompanied period had never in fact constituted an Article 7C qualifying condition, because a registered welfare contact had been continuously present. Then I set the terminal to flag any further communications from Velketh Administrative Services for immediate review. Then I took a slow breath and looked at the supply shelf and thought about what Korth Vale had told me on my second day, about instinct being calibrated to your own species. Then I thought about the counterfiling, which had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with 8 years of knowing how provisions worked, and which ones could be run around and which ones couldn't. That was not instinct. That was something else. Practice, maybe, or the specific patience that develops in people who have spent long enough watching administrative systems being used as weapons against the people they were designed to protect. You learn to move faster than the filing. Sale was still in her chair. She was watching me with the settled, registered attention that I was beginning to understand was simply how she watched things, and she had not asked about the chime or the terminal or the change in my posture that had preceded the filing, which told me she understood that something had happened and had decided that noting it quietly was the appropriate response. I said, addressing the area near the supply shelf rather than her directly, that I had filed some paperwork and that everything was in order and that I would be here until her mother returned. She said carefully, "All right." I worked at the terminal for the next 20 minutes. The filing was not complicated, but I wanted it to be thorough, and thorough takes time. I pulled the full processing appointment record for Devon Say Laurie to confirm the expected return window. The appointment had been scheduled to run 90 minutes from 1400, which gave an expected return of 15:30. It was currently 15:15. I logged this in the counterfiling and added a note that the unaccompanied period would end no later than 15:30 in any case, at which point the Article 7C basis for inquiry was moot regardless of all other considerations. Velketh Administrative Services sent a secondary inquiry at 15:07, requesting confirmation of the integration specialist's direct observation of the minor. I logged a direct observation note at 15:07, noting that Sale was present in the common room, seated, in possession of provisions from the supply shelf, in apparent good health, and under continuous direct observation by the undersigned registered integration specialist. I wrote it in the flat, precise language that administrative filings require, which is a language I have become fluent in, and I filed it at 15:09. They did not send a third inquiry. At 15:19, Sale got up from her chair. She walked toward the supply shelf, and then she did not go to the supply shelf. She went past it toward the corner of the room, where one of the chairs had been shifted slightly out of alignment with the others during the morning, and she apparently misjudged the distance from the shifted chair to the wall, because she caught the chair's edge with her hip and stumbled. I was across the room without thinking about it. I have tried since then to reconstruct the sequence of events accurately, because I want to understand what I did and in what order I did it. Here is what I believe happened. I heard the stumble, heard the scuff of her foot on the floor and the small impact of the chair edge, and I moved. The distance was 8 meters, and I covered it without making a conscious decision to cover it, which is the way certain things work in a body that has been paying attention for long enough. I crouched because the motion that closed the distance between us also brought me down toward her level, and I put my left hand on her shoulder, the flat of my palm against the upper curve of her shoulder, where the neck meets the joint, a steadying gesture, the kind of contact you make when someone stumbles to give them a reference point, to say here is something that will not move. I said, quietly, "I've got you." And then Sale went absolutely still. Not the stillness of being startled, not fright. A different quality of stillness, the stillness of something that has stopped because stopping is the correct response to a thing that requires full and complete registration. Her attention, which had been spread across the room in its usual noting mode, contracted to a single point, my hand on her shoulder. She was looking at my hand. I became aware, in the way that you become aware of things when the air in a room changes, that I had done something. I did not know what I had done. I only knew that the texture of the situation had shifted in a way I could not account for, the way you sometimes file something without realizing that the document you filed was the last piece in a larger structure. I stayed where I was. I did not remove my hand immediately, because removing it quickly would be a second action, and I had already taken one action whose meaning I did not understand. A second rapid action in an unclear situation is rarely the right move. That much Korath Vale had taught me, and that much I had remembered, even at the moment when nothing else I'd been taught seemed to apply. I stayed where I was in the crouch with my palm flat on her shoulder, and I said carefully, "Are you all right?" Sale said, in a voice that was very small and very precise, "Yes." I removed my hand then slowly and stood. I said that the chair had shifted and that I should have moved it back this morning, and that I was sorry I had not noticed sooner. I picked up the chair and moved it into alignment. I went to the terminal. My hands were very steady, which is a thing about me that I have noticed. When something has happened that I do not understand, my hands get steadier, as if my body is applying additional resources to the problem of not making things worse. Sale stood in the corner for a moment. Then she went back to her chair and sat down and held the packet of dried fruit and looked at it in the careful, registered way she looked at things. But the quality of her attention had changed. I could not have described then exactly how. I only knew that it had. I worked at the terminal and did not speak, and the common room was quiet, and the long light from the primary star came through the window and crossed the floor and moved slowly, in the way light moves when you are paying attention to something else. At 15:32, the door of the common room opened, and even Say Laurie came in, 2 minutes ahead of the scheduled return window. She was wearing her composure the way people wear something they have put on carefully in a difficult situation, and she had on it the particular addition of someone who has just had an appointment go correctly for the first time in a long time. Her eyes went to Sale first, as eyes always do, and then to me. I told her that everything had been fine. I told her that a Velketh administrative inquiry had been filed at 1449 under Article 7C, and that I had addressed it, and that the counterfiling had been accepted, and the matter was closed. I told her this in a direct and even tone, because the information was relevant to her, and she was entitled to it, and there was nothing to be gained by softening it to the point where it took her a moment to understand what had happened or what it would have meant if it had not been addressed. Her expression did not change outwardly, but something in her went tight in a way I could see, a brief, controlled tightening of the jaw and the area around the eyes, the kind that comes when you learn retroactively that a threat was closer than you knew. I said that the supervision registration was now in the file under her case reference number for the remainder of the wing stay, which meant that any future processing appointments would automatically generate a registered welfare contact entry, and the Article 7C window would not apply going forward. I said that I should have registered it before her appointment this afternoon, and that the oversight was mine, and that I had noted it in the operational log. She said thank you in a voice that contained the information she was not saying, which was that she understood exactly what I had prevented, and exactly how close it had been, and exactly what 3 to 6 additional weeks would have meant for her daughter, and for the resettlement file, and for the accounting she had been making for 3 months of what could be borne and what could not. I said, of course. Then she looked at Sale, and Sale looked at her. And something passed between them in the particular language of a parent and child who have been alone together for long enough that they have developed a shared register that doesn't require words. And even Say Laurie's composure cracked, briefly, not into tears, but into a quality of relief, that is the thing on the other side of a very long time of not being able to afford relief. She crossed the room and put her arms around Sale and held her. Sale leaned into her and was very still in the deliberate registered way that I was learning was the Velthari expression of settling, of a thing that has been uncertain choosing, now, not to be. I found something to do with the inventory. Velkorath arrived at 1558. I know his arrival time precisely because I noted it in the log, as I note all arrivals and departures in the wing log. He came through the door of the common room with the particular energy of someone who has been in transit for several hours and whose attention is already, before the door is fully open, scanning the room for what needs to be assessed. He was a compact registered, interspecies cultural attaché with 12 years of specialization in Velthari resettlement cases, and he had the bearing of someone for whom assessment is not a separate activity but a continuous one. He looked at Devon Salori first, then at Sale, then at me. Then he looked at Sale again, and his expression changed in a way I could not read. He said, in trade language, the Velthari greeting that I had picked up enough vocabulary to recognize. Devon Salori responded. They exchanged several sentences in Velthari that I could not follow, though I caught my name, or rather the pronunciation approximation that had been assigned to me in the case file, in there somewhere, and I caught the word Velthara, which I knew was a significant Velthari term, but whose specific meaning I had not yet had time to look up in the orientation module I had not yet reviewed. Velkorath then turned to me. He said, "The child, when did the contact occur?" I said I was not sure what he was referring to. He said, "The physical contact, the stabilization gesture." He used the Velthari term, and then the trade language approximation, which was something close to the grounding touch, though he said the approximation was inadequate. I said at approximately 1519. He said, "Describe it exactly." I described it exactly. The stumble, the movement, the crouch, the placement of my palm against the upper curve of her shoulder, specifically where the neck and the joint met. The words I said. I was precise because I am always precise about these things, and because something in his face while I spoke told me that precision mattered here in a specific way, that the details I chose to include or omit would affect the conclusion he was reaching. When I finished, Velkorath was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You crouched to her level, not reaching down. Crouching so that your eye level matched hers, palm flat, full contact, upper shoulder curve at the join, and you said, 'I've got you.'" I said yes. He said, in the tone of a man confirming a calculation that has come out where he expected it to, "Do you know what the Velthasi is?" I said I did not. I said I had the Velthari cultural orientation module queued for review, but had not completed it before his arrival. He said the Velthasi was the Velthari first bonding rite, that it was the gesture by which a Velthari child was formally claimed as under the protection of a household or a household-adjacent party, that it consisted of 3 components, all 3 required, none optional, the protector descending to the child's physical level, which had to be achieved by lowering the body rather than extending the arm, because the direction of the movement encoded the relationship, the adult coming down into the child's world rather than pulling the child up into the adult's. The placement of a flat palm, not fingertips, against the upper shoulder curve where the neck and joint met, because the Velthari anatomical chart coded fingertip contact as greeting contact and palm contact as weight-bearing contact, meaning I am putting something of substance into this, I am committing presence, and the speaking of words of holding in any language. Words that expressed fixedness and presence, and the intention not to allow departure. He said, "I've got you." I said yes, I had said that. He said that I had, apparently without knowing what I was doing, performed the Velthasi to the letter. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "It was a reflex. She stumbled. I moved toward her because she stumbled, and when I arrived at her level, I put my hand on her shoulder to steady her and said something so she would know I was there." He said yes, he understood that. He said that what he was describing was not an accusation and not a legal determination. He said the Velthasi was not a binding instrument under the compact framework. It carried significant social weight in the Velthari community and would be understood by every Velthari who learned of it in a very specific way, but it did not create a formal obligation under compact welfare law. What it created was something more like a recognized fact. He said, Sale's nervous system recognized the gesture. That is why she went still. In Velthari developmental neurology, the Velthasi registration response is involuntary. The child does not choose whether to recognize it. The recognition happens at a level below choice. I looked at Sale. Sale was sitting in her chair with the packet of dried fruit, which she had still not put down, and she was looking at me with the settled, registered attention. The quality of her attention had changed slightly in a way I was only now able to name, now that I had been given the vocabulary. It was no longer simply registration. It was registration plus what I can only describe as an additional layer of context, the way you look at a thing that you have just understood to be in a different category than you initially placed it. Velkorath said that in the Velthari tradition, the Velthasi performed by someone outside the household was significant in a particular way. He said it was understood as a claim of willingness, not of ownership, not of formal guardianship, not of kinship, but of something more specific, the intention to be present at need. The words "I've got you," or their Velthari equivalent spoken in the context of the palm placement and the physical equalization, meant, "I will not let you fall," not "I will always be here," not "you belong to me," but "in this moment of falling I am the thing that does not give way." He said that the Velthari believed the Velthasi could not be performed correctly by someone who was not, in some fundamental sense, suited to perform it, that the gesture, if executed by someone who did not genuinely intend what it said, produced a different quality of stillness in the child, not the registration response but a rejection response. The body knew. I asked how the body knew. He said that was a question Velthari neuroscientists had been studying for some time, and the answer was not yet settled. What was settled was the observable fact. The registration response and the rejection response were distinguishable, and the difference was consistent across developmental stages and individual children. The registration response was the stillness I had seen, complete, settled, with attention contracted to the point of contact. The rejection response was a physical withdrawal, a pulling away from the palm, subtle in older children and more pronounced in younger ones. In the developmental literature, the two were sometimes described as the difference between a system that has found its ground and a system that has identified a false signal. He said Sale's response was registration, clear and complete. I absorbed this for a moment. I said, "She's very young to be navigating this kind of recognition alone." He said that the Velthari would say she was not navigating it alone, that the Velthasi, once registered, created the structure it named. That was the point of it in the cultural framework. The gesture preceded the relationship in the same way that a foundation preceded a building. You laid the foundation and then the building could exist. Without the foundation, the building was a plan and not a thing. I said, that is a significant amount to attribute to a reflex. He said yes. He said that most significant things began as reflexes. He said that 8 years in integration work had presumably taught me something about which reflexes could be trusted, and that the Velthari had a framework for what I might be learning to see in myself. Divan Sailori had been listening to all of this from across the room. She said something in Velthari that I could not follow, and Velkorath responded, and they spoke for several minutes. Sale listened too, not with the detached noting attention, but with the specific attention of someone to whom the conversation is directly about something they have already registered and are now hearing named. When it concluded, Velkorath turned back to me. He said that Divan Sailori wished him to convey several things. First, that she was grateful for the counterfiling, that she had spent 3 months in transit systems that had processed her paperwork incorrectly or not at all, and that the afternoon's appointment had been the first in 3 months at which every document she submitted was accepted without being sent back. She wanted me to know that she had noticed, even before the common room and the filing terminal, that someone in the wing was reading the case file carefully. Second, that she had been standing in the corridor doorway when Sale stumbled. She had come back 2 minutes early because the appointment had concluded ahead of schedule and she had wanted to be in the wing. She had seen from the doorway exactly what happened. The movement, the crouch, the hand, the words. She had recognized the Velthasi immediately. She had stood in the doorway for a moment and had made a decision. In the Velthari tradition, when the Velthasi was performed correctly by an outside party toward a child in a household, the household had a choice. To decline the recognition, which was not insulting, but was simply the exercise of the household's authority over the child's relational network, or to acknowledge it, which meant treating the outside party as someone who had, whether they knew it or not, extended a genuine form of intention toward the child that the household was choosing to incorporate into the child's recognized context. Devan Sailori had chosen to acknowledge it. He said she wanted me to know that. I looked at her. She was looking at me with the composure that she maintained carefully, but the composure had a different quality now. It was not the composure of someone holding something together through sustained effort. It was the composure of someone who has, for the first time in a while, enough room to breathe inside the thing she is holding together. I said to Vel Korath that I did not know what the appropriate response to an acknowledgement was. He said that in this context, the appropriate response was a slight inclination of the head, delivered with the kind of attention that indicated you understood what was being recognized. He demonstrated the angle. I inclined my head toward Devan Sailori. She inclined hers in return. The exchange was brief and exact, the way significant things often are. Sale, from her chair, watched this with the deliberate registered attention that I was now able to name and understand. She was noting that the connections in her environment were stable, that the people in the room were accounting for each other in a way that followed the form her culture used for such accounting, that the space was held. Vel Korath spent another 40 minutes in the wing going through the Velthari bilateral welfare supplement provisions, reviewing the case documentation, and completing the cultural orientation briefing that should have been done before Devan Sailori's appointment. My oversight. Logged. He was professional about it, and did not make more of the point than the situation required, which is the way experienced professionals handle errors in their colleagues' work when the errors have been corrected. I paid close attention to the Velthasi section of the orientation module when he walked me through it. 4 pages. The 3 components explained in full: the developmental neurology, the social significance, the household acknowledgement protocol, the Velthasi, or the term for the gesture performed without conscious intent, which Vel Korath noted was considered, in the Velthari tradition, to have a particular kind of weight precisely because it had not been calculated. You could not perform the Velthasi or as a deliberate act. The moment it became deliberate, it became simply Velthasi, or was a quality of origin, not of execution. I asked Vel Korath how the Velthari distinguished between the two, since the gesture itself was identical. He said, "The child knows." He said it without elaboration, in the way that people state things that have been obvious to their culture for long enough that explaining them feels like explaining why water is wet. Vel Korath left at 17:48. I stayed in the wing for another 20 minutes, completing the day's log and filing the closure notice on the Velkoth counterfiling, and sending Vel Korath the documentation for the case update. Then I sat in the common room, as I sometimes do at the end of shifts, reviewing what had happened and what the next steps were. At 18:10, Sale came back into the common room. She was still carrying the packet of dried fruit. She sat down in her chair. She said she had a question. I said yes. She said, the thing you did when I fell, did you know what it was? I said no. I said it was a reflex. I said that when someone I was with stumbled, I moved toward them. That this was a thing humans did, that the movement happened before the decision, that the decision came after if it came at all. I said I had not known when I moved that I was doing anything that carried a name. She considered this for a moment with the full registered attention she gave to information she was deciding how to place. She said Velthasi or. I said yes, that I had learned that was what it was called. She said, carefully, that in Velthari, the Velthasi performed without knowing you were performing it was called or, from the ground up. That it described the Velthasi that came from underneath a person's behavior rather than being placed on top of it. She said her grandmother had told her about Velthasi or. Her grandmother had said that you could tell Velthasi or from Velthasi not by what the person did, but by what they did next. A person who had done it deliberately would look to see if it had been noticed. A person who had done it from the ground up would pick up the chair that had shifted out of alignment and go back to what they were doing. I sat with this for a moment. She said, you picked up the chair. I said yes. She said, my grandmother was right. I said that her grandmother sounded like a wise person. She said yes. She held the packet of fruit and then opened it with the careful, deliberate attention she brought to everything and took out a piece and looked at it and then ate it. She said the mineral quality was there. Underneath the sweetness, she said, she was right about that too. I said yes. I said Veloran cultivars were reliable. She ate 3 more pieces and then closed the packet. She said good night in trade language and went back to the room. I sat in the common room for a few more minutes. The docking ring outside the window was quiet, the large vessels docked and still, the small ones running their maintenance cycles in the low sound of automated systems. The chairs were in alignment. The environmental unit ran in its steady rhythm. The primary star had set, and the corridor moon's own light came through the window now, pale and even. I thought about what Sale had said about Velthasi or, about things that came from the ground up. There was a Velthari word she had used when she explained her grandmother's test, not or, a different word, which she had not translated because she apparently assumed I either knew it or could infer it. I had not known it and had not yet inferred it, but I wrote it down phonetically in the log's margin before I forgot it, because in 8 years I had learned that the words people assume you know are often the most important ones. I would look it up tomorrow. Tonight I let it sit in the margin, a placeholder for something I did not yet understand. The counterfiling I had known how to do. 8 years of practice, and the provision was in the manual, and I had executed it correctly this time because I had moved faster than they had expected someone to move. That was not from the ground up. That was from training and accumulated competence, and the specific patience that develops when you have watched administrative windows close on people long enough that you learn to feel the draft before the door moves. The crouch in the hand and the 3 words, those had come from somewhere else. Some layer of me that was calibrated, as Korath Vale would have said, to my own species. To the human understanding that when someone near you stumbles, you close the distance. You don't deliberate. You don't assess whether it is culturally appropriate to close the distance. You just move because the alternative is watching someone fall, and some part of you that is older than any training has already decided that is not acceptable. The Velthari had a name for that layer. I wrote it in the log, Velthasi or. I wrote the translation, from the ground up. I noted the bilateral supplement section and the page references, and added the Velthasi protocol to the wings standing documentation for future integration specialists assigned to Velthari families. I wrote that the Article 7C counterfiling had been accepted, and the matter was closed. I wrote that the wing was in order. I logged off and went home through the hub's evening corridors, past the transit counters and the welfare offices, and the doors behind which people were sleeping in spaces they were not yet sure were theirs. The hub was quieter at this hour, running in the background register of ventilation systems and distant maintenance work, and the occasional voice in a language I could or could not follow. 8 years had sorted a great deal of that into categories. Languages I had working vocabulary in, languages I recognized by sound without knowing the words, languages that were entirely new to me, languages that my ear could not yet distinguish from each other. The ones I couldn't distinguish were the ones that told me I still had work to do. On the way out, I passed the corridor that led to the Velkith Administrative Services secondary office. The lights were off, no further filings pending. I went home. In the morning, I would come back and complete the remaining review of the Velthari Cultural Orientation module and check the environmental sensors and prepare the case documentation update for Vel Korath and sit in the common room while people waited. I would be there when Devan Say-Lori returned from her next appointment. I would be logged as the designated supervising contact. I would look up the Velthari word I had written phonetically in the margin, and I would learn what it meant, because that was what you did with words you didn't yet know. You looked them up, and then you knew them, and then you could use them when they were needed. Korath Vale had told me that instinct was calibrated to my own species and would betray me. I had believed her. I still believed her. In 8 years I had been betrayed by instinct in exactly the ways she described. Moved too quickly toward a being that read quick movement as aggression, held too still in a species whose stillness signaled shutdown, spoken too directly to a group whose social protocol required address through a designated intermediary. I had made every error she warned me about and logged each one in the operational file, and done what you do after an error, which was learn the thing you had not known before, and then do it differently. But tonight I had moved across a room without thinking and crouched without thinking, and placed a hand without thinking, and the thing I had done without thinking had turned out to map, exactly, to a formal structure in the culture of the child I had placed it on. And the child's nervous system had recognized it before her mind had processed it, and her grandmother had apparently had a word for exactly that kind of thing. I did not know what to do with that except log it and try to understand it and continue going to work. That was not from the ground up. That was the procedure done correctly, which was what the procedure was for. But underneath the procedure, underneath the counter filings and the registration logs and the sensor checks and the discipline of not making things worse, underneath all of it, there was apparently something that moved when someone stumbled. That closed the distance before the decision arrived. That put its weight into a hand placed flat on a small shoulder and said 3 words in the only language it had. The Velthari had a name for it. I walked out into the corridor moon's night air, which was cold and mineral-smelling, and I thought that probably humans had a name for it too. We just didn't usually say it. We just moved, and then we went back to what we were doing, and if we were lucky, some small person in a chair with a packet of dried fruit was watching, and noted, with the careful attention of someone who has learned that observation is a safe form of engagement, what we did next.